regarding your bold advocacy for swift reform as opposed to the so-called gradual reform. So you brought here an evidence that the states that have gone the road of so-called moderate or gradual reforms have all failed, and basically hasn't been much reform and highly corrupt. And the successful states have gone boldly, Poland being kind of the beacon in a sense. But what about the flip side of the argument is the social cost? That what is the evidence after 20 years socially in terms of the effect on, again, the population, particularly disadvantaged, more vulnerable, the safety net? What has been actually the evidence in Poland and in the other successful countries? Because that is a powerful counter-argument to these swift reforms.
If you generally take Central Europe, life expectancy has increased enormously. All health indicators are far better. The smallest Gini coefficients, that is the least inequality, is in Central Europe. And after that, you have the Baltic states that started with major problems and had to recreate the states. So, in my book, Poland and Estonia are the strongest reformers, and they were also the strongest economic performers. And these are the countries that have more than doubled their GDP in this period. And you see it, all social indicators in these two countries have improved enormously. And of course, Poland is more interesting because it's almost as big as Ukraine, and also it has had a similar economic structure. So Poland is very much the country that Ukraine can compare with, and inequality is far greater in Ukraine. We are now seeing that Ukraine is going through one crisis after the other. So Ukraine lost officially 60% of its GDP in the 1990s. I think that's highly exaggerated, but say that it was a real fall of 30%. Then GDP fell again in 2008 by 15%. And now we are seeing a third big decline in GDP. So it's not only that this policy of providing a massive social welfare state that Ukraine can't afford, that it leads to no economic growth. It also leads to severe crisis. And if you take public expenditures in Ukraine, last year, as I mentioned, was 53% of GDP. In reasonable countries in the surrounding, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, they have 35% of GDP in public expenditure. So Ukraine is way above. And this is particularly spent on two things: energy subsidies, which are no good, as I've explained, essentially go to the oligarchs, and on pensions. Ukraine spends, under Yanukovych, 18% of GDP on public pensions, while a normal number in Europe is 9% of GDP. And if you start talking about pensions, people say, but they're so low, so how can you cut them? Well, they should not be given to people who are 50 years old, as is often the case in Ukraine. Ukraine is now increased the retirement age to 57 for women from 55. It should go up to 65, as is normal in Europe. Normally, it's 67 in Europe. So what we have is people who are in the upper 50s and early 60s. They do work, and they also get a pension. And the people who are suffering from this is the young people who can't have children or delay having children because they don't have incomes and have to pay high taxes. This is not a reasonable situation.
What about the actual delivery of social services? When you say the social inequalities have lessened in these fast reforming countries like Poland, do we have evidence that actually the social welfare programs got stronger, or in comparison with gradually or non-reforming states.
Absolutely. The Central Europeans from the beginning had relatively high unemployment allowances. Arguably, it was a mistake that they put too much on it, but the reason was very much to make it possible for enterprises to lay off workers. Well, throughout the former Soviet countries, enterprises used it as an argument that they could not lay off workers. Therefore, because there was no unemployment benefits, the same people then argued against unemployment benefit because it would be unnecessary state expenditures. Instead, in Russia and Ukraine, for many years, enterprise subsidies have been 10% of GDP. A well-functioning unemployment allowance system costs about 2% of GDP, about 1/5 of what the state enterprise subsidies cost. So this has very much been the issue. Give money to the people rather than to the enterprise managers.
You, Anders, you've been known since the beginning of your career as someone who doesn't shy away from making bold claims. You're not kind of the on the one hand, on the other hand kind of guy. And one of your latest bold claims in the book, which may contrast actually with previous discussion, is that you're actually saying that oligarchic power in Ukraine is on the way down.
Yeah, sure. If you look upon the best numbers we have, not that they're really good, it's the Forbes assessment of the wealth of the oligarchs. It has fallen by half in the last year. And for example, Rinat Akhmetov's holding company, System Capital Management, claimed a net loss last year of $1.8 billion. And it's quite obvious that they are bleeding. Part of it is because of a war. Part of it is because they have to flee the country. It's difficult to make money when you have to flee the country. And I'm thinking of Firtash in particular and the Yanukovych gang. But also the people who are still in Ukraine are making much less. If you take Pinchuk and Taruta, they have lost because Russia has undertaken sanctions against them. So all the big oligarchs have lost substantial assets. And, Igor Kolomoisky lost control over Ukhnafta, or not complete control, but he has can't take as much money out of Ukhnafta, the state oil company, as he could before. So all of them seem to be in a big problem. What we are seeing instead that is worrisome, it is some of the new officials who are making big money. And what really concerns me is the grey cardinals in the parliament who are organizing the financing for the political parties. Each party has one or two grey cardinals, normally sit on state enterprises and tap them on money, partly through transfer pricing and partly through state procurement, where they organize state procurement so that they get half of the money. And this is an old tradition in Ukraine, but it's maintained now mainly by the grey cardinals. So I'm more concerned about the grey cardinals, who are not very big businessmen, but perhaps have $100 million or $200 million in real fortune. But they are the people who are the big problem, and not so much the old oligarchs.
So you're saying we're witnessing the decline of the mega oligarchs, but the rise of the, I don't know if I should call them mini oligarchs, because it's still $200 million, but how would you characterize the current president?
Well, he promised to get out of a business, and he has not got out of a business. That's the fundamental thing. And when you walk in Kiev, you see new Russian shops popping up everywhere. This is not detachment from business as it should be. A president should put his assets in a blind trust. It's not necessary to sell the assets, but they should be in a blind trust.
We can also field questions. This is not to be meant to be the actor studio, a Q&A. So whenever there is a question, feel free. We'll start with Margarita, because you're in my blind spot. That's why I didn't see you.
I wanted to get back to your suggestion concerning the pension system, and we know what a difficult question this is from Greece to Ukraine, even in the European Union. What do you suggest, given the fact that there's very different life expectancies for males and females? What do you suggest doing in terms of pension ages? And also, how could the unpaid services that women 55 to 85 are providing to the maintenance of intergenerational solidarity, i.e. childcare, etc., how could that be replaced? But in particular, I'm interested about ages for men and women.
Well, what we are seeing is that one country after the other has raised the retirement age in Europe to 67, and clearly it's going higher than that, up towards 70, or that you choose simply when you retire because you have a capital. The World Bank pushed since '94 this three-pillar system. Virtually all countries not all, but almost all countries in Central and Eastern Europe have introduced such a system where you have one minimum pension for all. That's what the state should provide. Then you have one second pillar that goes into a compulsory private saving, and then you have a third with real private saving. So I don't think that is very dramatic. And then you try to raise the retirement age quickly, fast. And with regard to childcare, what happened generally in the former Soviet Union is that this was done by the old big state enterprises, and the childcare at the state enterprises has collapsed, and it needs to be reorganized.
What is the current male life expectancy in Ukraine and female life expectancy, and how would that fit in with current and proposed pension ages?
66, yes. And when Bismarck introduced the first pensions around 1870, then the male life expectancy in Germany was 38, and you got a pension from 70. It's not at all, it has no relationship between life expectancy and retirement age. I'm not exact on the numbers here, but I have them actually in this book for that purpose. So the state pension should be a minimum guarantee so that you can survive on your old age, and not a social welfare program for people who are in good shape and could and should work.
Is Anastasia in the back? Idea?
Thanks a lot for a very nice overview of what's going on back in Ukraine. I observe it from distance. So in your book, you also suggest how to fix the situation. So would you suggest a few pragmatic action plans, or one action plan? Where is the enter point, yeah? How to fix the situation? Because you give your book maybe to Poroshenko, he will say, oh, wow, it's a wonderful work. Let's indeed change, let's stop corrupting less, yeah? Let's, yeah? So what is a entry point? Because we know it's very difficult to change politics. Oligarchs will not stop stealing. All the political system really serves their interest. How do you suggest to fix it? Thank you.
Well, sorry, this is what I tried to present in a few bullet points. To start with the politics, and then the state, clean up the state. And the politics, a lot has been done. Normally, it's an iterative process. The most successful reform countries in Eastern Europe, Poland and the Baltic states, all four of them they change governments on average once a year during the first decade of transition. If your main problem is corruption, you don't want a stable government, because then everybody, or you will see a lot of stable corruption. So you want new people coming up, you want new political parties to develop. I think it was unfortunate that we only saw one really new political party develop in the last elections, because old political parties are normally corrupt. And as we see with these grey cardinals. But with a popular support, you get transparency and you get political change from the top and down. You reform the state, you reform the state finances, you can keep it going. You go after the worst corrupt things, as we have agreed here with Thane and Margarita, that it's the energy sector. And then something that is really essential in Ukraine, as I mentioned also, is the law enforcement system. And what is easiest to change there is the prosecutors. 18,000 prosecutors in Ukraine should be sacked. And there are enough young lawyers in Ukraine so that Ukraine itself can fill it up. When they did this in East Germany, about 1/3 came from West Germany. There are many foreigners who could also do these jobs. And 1/3 were young East Germans. That could be a much larger share in Ukraine. And 1/3 were re-educated old prosecutors. That number would probably be smaller in Ukraine. And they did something similar with the judges. But the point is that you have to start hard. And what I see of the public opinion today in Ukraine, it is that there are two different trends. One is we have to move from evolutionary to revolutionary changes, which is my line. The other line, which is not necessarily different from that, is populist. We want it all at once. And no understanding of public financing. We see that particularly in the discussion of a new tax reform, where the Minister of Finance has proposed 20-20-20 as rates for the big taxes. And the chairwoman of the tax committee in parliament from the Poroshenko blocks suggests 10-10-10 instead. That is only half a tax income, and is not interested in where the rest of income would come. So this is a populism. And similarly, I think it was Thane who mentioned that Yulia Tymoshenko now campaigns for cutting gas tariffs by half. Interestingly enough, Yuri Boyko from the opposition bloc also campaigns for cutting gas tariffs for half. And then you ask yourself, who made their fortunes on gas trade before? Perhaps they know who will benefit most from lower gas tariffs. And with regard to President Poroshenko, I am a member of his International Economic Advisory Board.
Ms. Lucan?
Yeah, so, you know,
Mike, Eddie, Mike.
So, I mean, you're not the first to make the Poland-Ukraine comparison, of course. And I guess I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with that comparison, not because I think what you're saying is wrong, but because, of course, I mean, you focus on the role of policy and different policies taken by the Ukrainian government as opposed to the Polish government. But, of course, there are a number of other factors that are not necessarily directly related, such as, you know, the fact that Poland had the opportunity to join the EU, closer proximity to Europe. So, so I'm wondering whether, you know, if there's a way of sort of slicing away those more other structural factors that are really not Ukraine's fault, in a sense. I mean, in the early 1990s, Ukraine was never given the opportunity to join the EU because it was considered part of the Russian sphere of influence. I mean, this was coming out of Brussels, not just Ukraine. So I guess, you know, so how much of that difference can we blame on policy per se, as opposed to these other more structural geographic factors?
You're, of course, right in this, but let me take on what has changed here. In the 1980s, millions of Poles were out in Western Europe, studying or working, however, and got a lot of experience and learned. In the last 10 years, millions of Ukrainians have made the same experiences. So this means that Ukraine now looks more like Poland in this regard than it did. The concern is that corruption is much more deeply rooted in Ukraine today than it ever was in Poland. My conclusion from that is that one should be more radical in the approach. And of course, Ukraine has a much stronger high-tech and agriculture than Poland had at that time. But with regard to the European Union, the European Union market must open up. And this should be a major thrust of Ukrainian foreign policy. Ukrainians are sort of too humble in this and say that we can't really demand that. Yes, you can demand that. This is not quite acceptable. What the European Union has not done for Ukraine. And the problem is that the European Union now has a very weak leadership. So the European Commission seems weaker than it has been for a very long time, and it's Germany that is running Europe's foreign policy, and they can't do everything either. So, and then with regard to relations with Russia, you can say that Ukraine's relations with Russia have now declined to what they were with Poland in around 1990, and this should make it easier for Ukraine now to follow the Polish example. So I think that it does make sense, but in some way it is the new situation that has developed in Ukraine, because this great human capital did not exist in Ukraine to the same extent a decade ago.
Sophia?
And what happens with Donbass?
Devastating question. The general view is that Putin wants to have a frozen conflict because that is his general attitude. My suspicion, my starting point is that Putin couldn't care less about the EU. NATO was never on the table, and that his interest is that the current Ukrainian regime will fail, because he's really seeing what is happening in Ukraine as a domestic threat to Russia. He does not want to see democratization in Russia. So therefore, I think this was a preemptive strike against democracy in Russia. My good friend Michael McFaul and I happened to co-edit a book about the Orange Revolution. And President Putin twice attacked Mike McFaul for this book, complaining to his senior people that why have you sent an ambassador here who's only here in order to organize an orange revolution against me? So this is what Putin really seems to believe. And I think we should see Donbass in that perspective. So how do you most successfully destabilize Ukraine? Well, why not give Donbass back? The Russian engineering troops have systematically blown up the bridges. They have bombed factories quite severely. Production is now in the heavy industry at 30% of the previous level. And there are certain political problems there also. So why not give it back to Ukraine, to destabilize Ukraine as much as possible? So this is what I suspect will happen. And if Russia has given it back, why should it pay anything for it? It must be another task that Putin can delegate to the European Union, which is not likely to do it. But this is only a guess.
Hilda?
Yes, I think it kind of maybe follows a bit on the last question. I just wondered, you mentioned in your presentation that one of the big challenges was the politics and the people's frustration. And I think also you mentioned the conflict. So I just wonder, how do you see those two factors as influencing the ability of the government now to actually go through with the kind of more unpopular reforms? And yeah, so I just wondered how do you view that? And I mean, I was thinking, for example, also in terms of the deliberations in Minsk, and you've seen already that there is a lot of, maybe at the moment there is a lack of kind of social, what do you call it, people are not kind of protesting that openly on certain issues because they need to keep the government together. But to come the time when that kind of factor disappears, then how will they be able to deal with all these unpopular issues also?
Well, I would say that since the 1st of September, when the ceasefire actually started, we see that there is much more domestic tension. Because previously, indeed, people thought that it was wrong to criticize the domestic rulers. After the 1st of September, we have seen much more criticism against corruption and mismanagement. With regard to the Ukrainian government, in particular, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, on the one hand, he's the person who does the reforms, so he gets the anti-reformers against him. On the other hand, he does not do enough reform to support, to satisfy the reformers. So therefore, we see that he has now a popularity rating around 1%, so that he has lost both sides. And this shows how dangerous it is to try to stir a middle way. If you are going to reform, you have to go all out. Otherwise, you get people against you. And with regard to popular dissatisfaction, my suspicion is that the local elections now will not be very important for the national politics, because people vote for the mayors who are quite different groups. We will see a lot of different parties, none of them very, very strong. And probably participation will be rather low, as is normally the case in a local election. So I think it will be a mixed picture that is not very obvious, and therefore, and it will not benefit the people who can really push for early elections. And I thought also it was very interesting, this vote in Parliament of debt restructuring, that on the 17th of September, that 309 deputies voted in favor, a majority in each and every single party. Particularly, I was struck by Yulia Tymoshenko, who had argued against it in public 2 days before, and then she voted, and a big majority in her party voted for the debt restructuring. That suggested partly that they were not so populist, but reasonably responsible, and partly that they did not want to have early parliamentary elections. So early parliamentary elections should be avoided in this situation, because two bad examples of elections that have taken place almost 2 years after the reforms have started, that's Russia in December 93. You don't want to repeat that experience. Or Poland in October 91, when Solidarity all of a sudden split into 20 different parties, and it was almost impossible to form a government afterwards. So it's good with government instability, but you don't want early parliamentary elections now.
Mikhailo?
I want to make one comment, if I may, and then I'll have a question. My comment, actually, we lost the thread on pension reform, but I did want to make a comment on that one. There's an interesting piece there's an interesting idea, let's put it that way, that's going through various ministries of social policy, et cetera, to take the Brazilian example, where urban residents have a different pension age than rural residents, because the average age really in Ukraine is problematic. People will not live to see their pensions. However, if you actually factor in urban versus rural residents, you get to urban residents live much longer than rural residents, and particularly that is with respect to women. Women, unfortunately, in rural regions are dying much, much faster than they would be in urban regions. That's my comment. Now, as for the question, I fully agree with everything that was said with respect to the problems of reform and the need for faster reform and gradualism. Ukraine has lived 25 years of gradualism and sees the results. The issue is actually now how to fix it. And the question is, we know that the metal sector is dying or has died completely. We know that there is really very little that can be done in terms of maximizing more out of the agricultural sector. We know that there is a vibrant IT sector, however, it is still relatively small. In each of the successful countries, Anders, that you've mentioned, Poland, for example, the driver of recovery was, for example, small manufacturers and services. The driver in Estonia was actually public-private partnerships based on building communications infrastructure and an IT infrastructure for the country so that we could have a service economy that is very high-tech. What, in your opinion, is the driver of recovery in Ukraine?
Three drivers. First, agricultural production and food processing. Ukraine has extremely good preconditions. And Ukraine, black soil, black earth is generally like Illinois. And the yields are less than half of what they are in corresponding areas. So Ukraine should double its grain harvest. And of course, Ukraine is uniquely well done for corn and soy and so forth. And we have seen the right restructuring, but there's a massive expansion possible. And the big thing that is needed there is to finally legalize private sales of agricultural land, so that you can use agricultural land for as collateral for bank loans. This is a massive potential. Unfortunately, there is a strong public opinion against it. So, and this has simply to be explained, and also that governance improves so that people don't think that they will be cheated out of their land, as they, for rather good reasons, think so. The second is high tech, which is strong and should develop. The third, which will be much bigger, is to get into the European supply chain, as Central Europe has done. In recent years, Romania and Bulgaria have developed quite well, mainly Romania, thanks to this. And if you look upon salaries today, a salary in Ukraine is about 1/8 of a Polish salary. And it's very easy to cross the border. This is something that should be developed very fast and well. And Ukraine's infrastructure is frankly quite decent. Then moving back to the metallurgy, it should not die. The big problem is that Ukraine has not invested in metallurgy. There are 2 modern steelworks in Ukraine. Interpipes Dniprosteel in Dnipropetrovsk and Industrial Union of Donbass, Alchevsk steelworks. All of the others are old Soviet steelworks that have hardly modernized for the last 30 years, other than in detail. So, for example, Rinat Akhmetov has been too occupied buying new steelworks and new assets. He doubled his number of employees under Yanukovych, 4 years in power. So, and if you buy a lot of assets, you don't have the money to invest in your old assets. It's not that Akhmetov has been irrational. I think that he's quite a sensible businessman, but he didn't have the money to invest in capital development. So I think much more can be done in the metallurgical sector, because Ukraine has uniquely good conditions for metallurgical development. It has iron ore, it has coal, It has a good technology, it has a tradition, and it has sea transport where all of these assets are available. So this is exactly what you need for modern metallurgy. So this should come back, and then of course now 1/3 of the banks have closed down. Another third will probably close down. The best time to invest in banking is after there has been a major cleanup in the banking system. This is what happened in the Baltics, for example, in '99. I don't agree with your characterization of what happened in Estonia. The big thing that happened in Estonia was Nokia. So the private companies in Estonia largely developed as subcontractors to Nokia. And the private-public partnership is what I absolutely would avoid in Ukraine. It's the best way of developing corruption after gas trade. And therefore, I think it's very, very dangerous. Whenever I discuss with anybody who wants to invest in the Ukraine, I say avoid any joint ventures. You want to own a company, and you want to have good Ukrainian managers who have their share in it, but you don't want to have a public-private partnership because then you will get stuck in business practices that your owners cannot accept.